Listen closely. There is a path through the underbelly of our past where the laws of gods and men were bent until children became currency. In the year 1848, when America still smelled of coal smoke and new rail ties, a hidden trade threaded rivers and taverns, ports and plantations. You will hear names no history book offers willingly, names carved on ledger margins, whispered in taverns at dawn, buried inside customs manifests. This is not a tale of accidental cruelty, it is a ledger of intentional choices, where smugglers, clerks, and men of faith colluded to turn flesh into merchandise. The smugglers moved like shadows along the Ohio and the Mississippi, trading orphans and runaways for chests of opium bound for New England and the distant ports of Asia. Merchant houses in Baltimore and Boston kept off, books ledgers marked with coded initials, and a web of middlemen stretched from Appalachia to the Gulf. Their boats were unremarkable at first glance, creaking barges and flatboats that smelled faintly of tar and bread. Yet beneath their planks were hollowed compartments where small bodies were hidden like contraband. At night the river swallowed secrets and vomited them upstream. Lantern signals stitched between wharves, and the low whistle of a ferry called out like an accomplice. A child left at a wharf with a ribbon on her wrist became an entry in a ledger. The ribbon was the invoice number, the ledger the verdict, and the men who signed those pages wore sober coats and respectable faces. Midwestern townsfolk turned their heads while agents of commerce counted what they called small cargo, and when a customs official took a bribe the law simply rearranged itself. Church bells tolled and parishioners prayed while churchwardens signed receipts that reclassified guardianship as temporary apprenticeship. Families that suspected the truth were offered vague reassurances and a sack of coin. Witnesses were rare, and when they did speak their words were trimmed by fear and by threats thinly disguised as counsel. This trade used the language of benevolence to disguise the ledger's teeth, and it learned the nation's soft spots. Hunger, disease, a parent's despair. If this buried history pulls at you, subscribe and tell me where you listen from in the comments as we peel back the shroud. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. The map of this commerce was written in waterways and back roads, not in the columns of polite society. A route began in Appalachia where coal towns and ruined farms met, where single mothers and widowers learned how quickly an offer could sound like salvation. Men calling themselves agents of improvement promised apprenticeships in distant mills, safe passage to relatives in the cities, or simply medicine for a fever that would not wait. They used the neutral language of indenture and employment contracts to cloak the transaction, drafting paper with formal seals so precise they fooled cursory eyes. A child in such a document lost a name and gained a date. They became indentured to a house in New Orleans or a household in Salem, Massachusetts. Yet the ink concealed the other exchange. Chests of opium bound for Canton and Calcutta funneled southward in return. The opium fed markets overseas and also lubricated the domestic machine of concealment. Bribes to portmasters, favors to magistrates, the occasional gift to a zealous minister. In far-flung ledger books, the same columns tracked both shipments on one line, bales of cotton on another, a girl described as to be placed in domestic care. The numbers fit like puzzle pieces. One midshipman's diary, found folded inside a cigar box in a Rhode Island attic generations later, mentions a child boxed beneath the gunwale, and then notes a cargo of laudanum bound for trade. That dry, bureaucratic entry is the work of men who learned how to make atrocity routine. Learn to read these dry lines and the horror emerges. The routes used established channels, canals, river landings, wagon roads, and a network of safe houses managed by women who pretended to be midwives or seamstresses. Tavern keepers served ale and signed off on alibis. The trade relied on a thin veil of legitimacy, a certificate of apprenticeship, a letter from a concerned benefactor, a note from a lawyer whose hand rarely trembled. Inspections were cursory, because inspectors were sometimes paid not to look. The economy that birthed the trade rationalized it. Children were future labor, and opium was necessary commerce. Both claims wore the armor of convenience. What we call morality unraveled when people decided the ledger mattered more than the body. In the quiet rooms behind inns, they bartered names as one trades livestock, pronouncing terms and moving on to the next sale as if grief were a ledger entry, not a living thing. In coastal towns, the trade wore a different face. Shipping manifests were neat. Captains knew to erase a child's trace by listing miscellaneous stores or household effects. Entire families were sometimes coaxed into believing relocation offered safety, convinced by pamphlets that promised shelter and schooling in cities that never intended to shelter them. A mother's signature, taken under candlelight and coaxed with promises of medicine or a future bride price, became a legal instrument that bound her child across state lines. There were formalized exchanges, not always hidden by violence, but by paperwork and persuasion, and those paper exchanges were the trade's scaffolding. Smugglers learned to be invisible within bureaucracy. They hired clerks who could replicate forms with uncanny accuracy. They bribed not only port officials but also certain ministers and orphanage directors who benefited from what they called charitable placements. Those placements often led children into households where the promised instruction was slavery in all but name, long hours, hard labor, and no path back. The opium arrived in return as a dual currency, a substance for foreign markets that also financed the domestic machinery of exploitation. Men who trafficked opium found their coffers full. They attended town halls and invested in docks and mills, laundering moral stains into respectable holdings. Local power structures bent to the flow of that cash. Judges with mortgages found ways to dismiss inconvenient complaints. Sheriffs with debts looked the other way when cargo manifests seemed lawful. The presence of opium in the exchange gave the trade scale. It could underwrite payments large enough to bribe and to buy silence. Over time, entire port neighborhoods grew dependent on that flow. Skilled workers who loaded and unloaded ships grew accustomed to the extra coin. Shopkeepers accepted it as payment. The economy of a neighborhood adjusted, and moral outrage shrank under the weight of prosperity. The trade also thrived in shadowed lanes and on fog-choked piers where the river's mist shielded transactions. Children were moved in the half-light between barges, their small forms passing through nets and beneath tarps, and by morning their disappearances were muffled by the day's bustle. Records, when they existed, were sanitized and catalogued under impersonal categories. It was a bureaucracy designed to make grief administratively invisible. The people who profited framed their actions in the language of necessity and civility, and so the trade endured. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. In town halls and parlor rooms, the argument advanced like a slow poison: our nation must grow, industry must be supplied, and children rescued from squalor will become assets to families and to commerce. Men with ties to shipping firms dressed the practice in patriotic rhetoric. They called it a seedbed of labor, a means of making America stronger. Beneath those words lay a more blunt calculus, the arithmetic of supply and demand. Markets wanted workers. Markets wanted opium. Supply networks arranged themselves like a new kind of infrastructure. In the soft glow of lamplight, contracts were drawn with clauses that no literate parent could fully comprehend. Clerks used legalese as a net, capturing consent where desperation had offered only confusion. The judiciary in many places lacked the bandwidth or will to test every signed page against the human face it bound. And so the trade became institutionally assisted, not solely through outright conspiracy, but through the slow drift of law into convenience. Sometimes the drift was deliberate. There are records, fragments hidden in courthouse basements or recycled as scrap paper for other accounts, that show magistrates accepting letters of placement without cross-checking their provenance. Those letters, often written in the hand of a merchant who also supplied opium, carried a veneer of respectability. Parish records added another layer of cover. Ministers who preached charity sometimes documented transfers as acts of mercy. When questions were raised, explanations arrived. Relocation for better prospects, apprenticeship under a reputable family, placement for schooling. The explanations were weapons of normalization. Once normalized, the trade acquired social inertia. Citizens doing casual business with these men could later claim ignorance, as if ignorance were a cloak that absolved. Yet the cloak did not fit everyone. Some clerks' records outlived their lies, and the discrepancies were the thin threads that would one day be pulled. Those threads often began with a single stubborn complaint. A neighbor who noticed a child's ribbon, a midwife who questioned a new baptismal entry, And from that complaint a map of complicity slowly emerged. The map was ugly. It wound from riverbank to counting house to parish pew. There were men who entertained notions of regulation and reform, but reform rarely caught the same wind as profit. When inspectors did arrive, they found obstacles arranged like polite traps, receipts written in foreign hands, witnesses who had moved on, orphans whose collars bore different names. The trade learned to sabotage oversight with speed. A single falsified bill of lading could derail an investigation for months. In other cases, officials simply couldn't see the moral equation. They worked within a system that valued commerce as a wholesome good, and thus refused to see commerce's sickly bargains. But the trade also recruited the desperate. Consider the Appalachian farmstead, where a drought or a mine collapse could reduce an entire household to mortgaged hunger. A man arriving with the offer of placement for a child often presented the only immediate relief. He offered coin for seed, a medicine chest, or the payment needed to bury a spouse. When men accept a sum and a promise to care for their child elsewhere, the transaction becomes exchangeable with a single paper signature. Later, the ledger shows a child's name crossed out and an entry of transportation paid. The family went on with the immediate relief. The long-term loss became a private sorrow recorded in the margins of memory. Witnesses to these trades were sometimes the very people who profited from them. Midwives paid to hand over infants, tavern keepers who provided rooms for strangers, bakers who delivered bread to ships taking on cargo. Each small transaction made the system more robust. That robustness allowed the trade to scale beyond isolated predations and into a network whose reach touched inland counties and coastal warehouses alike. There were also men who resisted, petty judges, a handful of priests, and port inspectors who refused to sign away their conscience. Their refusals were small but meaningful. In some towns, the refusal manifested as rumor that spread until sailors and captains grew wary. In others, refusals were swallowed by intimidation. The trade had muscle as well as money. Men who protected the routes were prepared to use force threats to expose reputations, blackmail of those with debts, or in worst cases, violence. That readiness to use force made the trade a kind of shadow sovereignty in places where state reach was thin. The route itself bore signatures of its sordid craft. It threaded through river towns where boats unloaded not only bales and barrels but also bargains. From Pittsburgh down the Ohio, through Cincinnati, where warehouses masked side doors, the network asked toward New Orleans and the Gulf. Along the way, safe houses were mapped in ink. Only the trade's participants could read: a tavern with a crooked sign, a mill that closed on certain nights, the widow who took in children and kept them out of sight. Women often were the stewards of concealment. They boarded children as apprentices, stitched new garments to cover old names, and whispered new stories to make a past forgettable. Men with more brutal roles oversaw transport: river hands who knew which sandbar hid the low-placed skiff, captains who timed fog and tide to move human cargo unseen. Payment flowed southward in rolls of currency and often returned northward as opium filled chests. The road's anatomy was precise. Every stop had purpose. At certain docks an exchange would be negotiated. At others, a child would be left in the care of a tutor, who was in fact an agent for further movement. The ledger recorded only logistics. It did not engrave the ache. And yet traces remained: a seamstress's stitch, a smudge of soot under a child's fingernail, a mismatched pair of boots. These small details later told investigators where a child had passed. They were breadcrumbs in a trail the trade tried desperately to erase. In some towns, caravans of apprentices were advertised in newspapers with phrases like "suitable for household service," and respectable families took them in, believing themselves benevolent patrons. The ones who took them willingly, who bought the pretense of charity as a robe to cover their complicity, became part of a chain that pulled these children toward destinies not of the mind, but of market demand. Yet even within this grim commerce, moments occurred when human decency cracked the ledger. A dock worker who refused the coin, a seamstress who ran off with a child's boot to hide it, a midwife who slipped a baby a different name. These acts complicated the trade and left openings for rescue. Those openings, when seized by courageous few, allowed some children to escape the ledger's erasure. Resistance took many forms, and it rarely looked like grand rebellion. Often it was a single clerk misfiling an invoice so persistence could later find the discrepancy. Often it was a minister who insisted on baptism records being accurate and who asked pointed questions when children arrived with no prior notice. Those awkward questions sometimes generated answers that smelled of falsehood. The ledger's coherence relied on a chain of stories that never touched the mouth of truth. When a single story cracked, so did the facade. There were also investigative correspondences, letters between worried relatives and distant agents, packed with fear and the faint hope that bureaucracy could be made to repent. A letter from a mother in a mountain hollow, addressed to a merchant in Boston, might travel through hands and come back with stamps and notes that revealed who had moved her child. In other cases, chance intervened. A ship's log misplaced a notation, or a captain's handwriting betrayed a pattern only later recognized by a persistent magistrate. Such small slips allowed the map of the trade to be redrawn, not in favor of the smugglers but against them. The more these slips accumulated, the more they formed a language of exposure. Investigative zeal had its own currency, knowledge. Men and women who saved fragments of manifests, who kept private journals of odd exchanges, or who kept careful account of the names that reappeared in strange places were the trade's latent enemies. In the 1840s, newspapers in growing cities began to publish curious notices: missing child aged 8, believed to have been taken to sea. And the pattern became evident to those willing to read between the advertisements for dry goods and the shipping schedules. Public sentiment turned slowly because the trade had deep roots and soft justifications, but it turned nonetheless. And when public sentiment shifts, institutions that thrive on appearances find their structures shaken. The smugglers found ways to fight back silence bought with coin, the discrediting of accusers, and occasionally, the threat of violence against those who pried too hard. Yet even these methods could not fully stop the spread of knowledge. Every whispered complaint, every ledger inconsistency, every unexpected baptismal record carried the risk of unraveling the tidy myths that allowed the trade to persist. In the archival shadows there are documents that read like confessions, not confessions written as such, but lists whose cumulative weight acts as one. They are the ruined receipts, the double entries, the marginalia that a future historian will stitch into a narrative of complicity. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Among them are the names of men with respectable occupations: a ship's purser, a man listed as assistant to the portmaster, a woman once described simply as caretaker. The ledger shows where a child was placed, and on the line below, an entry of condensed opium shipped out. On the margins, a terse note: payment cleared. Those who kept these books were not always cruel by temperament. Many were merely bureaucrats who learned to fold moral quandary into paper. But the papers themselves do not absolve, they sentence. When a child vanished from a farm in the Alleghenies and later appeared in a market town without records of legitimate guardianship, a paper trail sometimes led to a warehouse where opium was catalogued beside boxes of household supplies. The juxtaposition is not incidental. It is the trade's signature. Researchers who have combed these papers describe a pattern: a harvest of need matched by the harvest of opium profits, and between them the commodification of the vulnerable. The route connecting those ledgers was not linear. It spun like a wheel, radiating out to centers of commerce and back again. Letters stained with tears sometimes accompanied legal forms, notes that begged for mercy and offered compliance. The complicit used such notes to soothe conscience. They catalogued sorrow as paperwork resolved, yet not all records favored the smugglers. Occasionally a ledger entry included a notation in a different hand, a name crossed out and replaced, an asterisk adjacent to a date, and those marks were the whispers of conscience that would later provide leads. Where a child had been listed under multiple names across different manifests, a pattern of movement emerged, and the pattern could be traced. The very bureaucracy that enabled concealment also created the breadcrumbs for discovery. It is a bitter irony the trade hid itself in paper, and paper ultimately unmasked it. There were certain towns that functioned as linchpins in the route, places where the river's commerce met inland roads, and where the trade could blend seamlessly into the city's legitimate bustle. On foggy mornings, carts wheeled into warehouses while clerks tallied cargo by dusk. A child might be moved into the care of a woman described as companion or young servant, and no one would ask why there was no prior family record. In some cases, a child's motion through the system reflected broader societal patterns of displacement, war, refugees, immigrant families, and the newly unemployed all created an availability that the trade exploited. Men who worked the docks became adept at misdirection. They learned to list miscellaneous items under a mark that meant something only to them, and they taught that mark to a trusted circle. Across these towns, the trade established a cadence: arrival, registration, temporary boarding, and final shipment. That last step often involved travel by night, the hush of oars, the concealment beneath tarps, and the movement toward a ship that would carry both the child outward and the opium northward. Those who operated the route developed a vocabulary of absolution. They framed what they did as placing the child in better hands, securing a future laborer, or protecting the family from destitution. It was a language tailored to the listeners they hoped to persuade: town elders, magistrates, or anxious parents. The trade's rhetoric worked because it mirrored common narratives of mobility and improvement that defined 19th century American aspiration. It appealed to a hope that relocation equaled uplift and that industry would reward the hardworking. But beneath the rhetoric lay the cold algebra of exchange. The man who took a child received a ledger entry. The ledger bought a chest of opium. The chest of opium bought influence and paid dues to maintain silence. Town structures that could have intervened, courts, parishes, civic leaders, often lacked either the will or the means to stop it. And in many places, the trade became normalized precisely because it filled gaps left by weak institutions and fierce survival needs. As the trade matured, its methods diversified. The early periods relied heavily on deceit through documentation and the quiet barter of desperate families, but later phases saw more elaborate coordination. Captains who had once trusted only their own hands began to coordinate with inland agents. A network of men who could shepherd a child from a mountain settlement to a port without leaving obvious traces. These agents established routines, lists of innocuous items to hide children among, seasonal patterns to avoid scrutiny during harvest or winter shipping lulls, and coded phrases in letters that meant "move tonight" or "hold at warehouse." With coordination came specialization. Certain men specialized in forging safe papers, others in bribing officials, still others in sheltering children until desired shipments were ready. Women who had been midwives or laundresses took on roles as caregivers who could also falsify family stories. The sophistication meant fewer mistakes and fewer chances for discovery, but it also meant the trade required more moving parts, and every additional part increased the risk of exposure. Networks can be infiltrated, and the trade's network eventually showed its seams. A disgruntled clerk, a jealous partner, or a conscience-stricken minister could turn a whisper into a lead. Once a lead appeared, investigators had to thread through a complex tapestry of legitimate commerce and illicit exchange. They combed ship manifests, compared baptismal records, subpoenaed tavern accounts, and followed payments. The work took patience and tenacity, more of a scholarly forensic labor than dramatic intervention, but it worked. Some children were recovered when investigators followed a chain of payments from opium chests back to men who had received cash for provisions. Those payments sometimes led to storage rooms, to addresses where children were found alive and frightened, their names half remembered, their past blurred by alternate accounts given to them by strangers. Recovery stories were often messy. Children had adapted to new identities, found new affection mixed with cruelty, and some resisted separation from those who had taken them because human bonds form in whatever soil they are planted. Yet each recovery undermined the trade's claim to legitimacy. The more children found and the more ledgers cross-referenced, the closer authorities came to recognizing this as not isolated sin but organized commerce. The structural reason the trade persisted was its entanglement with legal gray areas of the era. Indentured servitude, apprenticeship, and guardianship had legitimate users and legal frameworks that could be perverted. A contract that promised training could be administered by a man who thought only of profit. Laws that aimed to regularize labor migration sometimes provided the language of legality the trade needed. Consider the case of an apprenticeship agreement. signed in a parlor by a man who promised to teach a child a useful trade. In theory, such a document gave a child social mobility. In practice, it could strip them of protection and hand them to those who treated them as unpaid labor. Elected officials debated the bounds of such arrangements, but the statutes were often vague, and vagueness favors the resourceful. When legislators moved to tighten definitions, local economic interest groups pushed back, arguing that regulation would stifle commerce and burden families seeking relief. Those arguments had traction in town halls where economic survival and moral clarity were entangled. Economic arguments carried rhetorical weight. Merchants argued that limiting apprenticeship transfers would hamper the flow of necessary labor to mills and ships, thus harming the whole community. It was an argument designed to make morality look impractical. Meanwhile, powerful men who profited from opium shipments had influence enough to nudge policy discussions away from scrutiny. They invested in civic institutions, attended charity boards, and used philanthropic appearances to cloak their hands. That civic veneer bought them time and added layers between their deeds and public view. Yet the legal cloud couldn't last forever. When press coverage began to compile patterns, when journalists noticed the same names recurring in story after story, the rhetoric of necessity started to sound like a calcified defense. Citizens who read these accounts began to question whether prosperity built upon such transactions was truly prosperity at all. Public debate moved from polite parlor talk to the pages of newspapers and meeting halls, and once the matter reached public ears, it became harder to condense into a comforting narrative. Investigators and reformers found allies in unexpected places: dock workers tired of seeing children hidden in crates, employers who resented competition from unpaid labor, and religious leaders appalled by the misuse of charitable rhetoric. These allies organized quietly at first: secret letters, private meetings, coded lists of suspicious shipments, and then more openly. If the trade had relied on the cover of routine paperwork, the reformers relied on the cumulative power of documentation exposed. They would publish lists comparing ship manifests with parish rolls, showing mismatches and anomalies. They researched payment flows, traced opium consignments, and connected the dots between a child's disappearance in a mountain hollow and a chest of laudanum sold months later. When such connections were presented in public forums, the communal immunity of complicity faltered. Wealthy merchants who had enjoyed social standing because of their investments began to fear reputational risk. Municipal councils convened inquiries, and although some inquiries were stymied by coercion or bribery, others produced results: small rescue operations, prosecutions for falsified documents, and the arrest of low-level operatives. These early victories were uneven and modest but crucial. They demonstrated that the trade's infrastructure could be penetrated and that the ledger's neatness was not invincible. Recovery efforts were painstaking. Children who had been moved needed both physical rescue and the slow work of recovering identity. Records that reformers compiled, lists of purchasers and their addresses, sometimes led to households where children were sheltered and where a legal route could be pursued. Those households became evidence in courtrooms, and courtrooms, when they acted, offered public spectacle that undermined the trade's social immunity. But the trade's defenders fought back with every tool at hand. Smugglers used influence to intimidate witnesses, they leveraged debts to silence midwives, and they used social standing to discredit reformers. A merchant accused of complicity might respond by funding a charitable wing of a local church, thereby complicating the moral calculus of his accusers. The courtroom became a place of sharp rhetoric. Attorneys argued that evidence was circumstantial, that the child's apprenticeship was voluntary or agreed, that the manifest was consistent with known goods. Judges in towns where influence ran deep sometimes hesitated to press charges against men who invested in the community. Furthermore, the trade adapted tactically. When inspectors tightened scrutiny in one port, shipments rerouted through smaller, less guarded landings, corrupted clerks moved to new towns, and the trade's ledger learned new codes. The legal and illicit systems thus waged tide like campaigns, each trying to outmaneuver the other. But no matter how hard smugglers pushed, they could not erase the human residues of their commerce. Children who escaped carried stories, mothers who survived held memory, midwives kept notes. The cumulative human evidence became a moral battery capable of discharging increasing public outrage. As more stories surfaced, an ethical atmosphere formed that made it harder for respectable men to cloak their deeds in the language of necessity. Commerce could no longer wash its hands of the moral stains so easily when civic pride and conscience were increasingly mobilized against it. The opium connection turned out to be a particularly damning thread because opium's own networks were international and thus left distinctive traces. When chests labeled for foreign trade were examined, customs officials sometimes noted discrepancies, quantities that did not match invoices, seals that had been resealed, or origins that disagreed with manifests. Those small anomalies allowed investigators to link particular shipments to known routes used for moving children. Ship logs occasionally recorded offhand entries like additional stores or extra hands embarked, and a persistent reader could see where such euphemisms hid people. The foreign dimension also gave reformers leverage. International pressure could be invoked. Traders who relied on foreign partners risked sanction, and news that crossed oceans could expose reputational risk beyond local influence. Merchants who once claimed immunity because of local standing now faced the prospect of losing trade partners. That global vulnerability made some men change tactics, and when tactics changed, opportunities emerged for reformers to press advantage. Pressure arrived not only through legal means but also via moral suasion. Missionary societies and temperance groups highlighted the human cost of opium, funded commerce, and their pamphlets reached a readership that included investors and politicians. Moral narratives began to reframe the trade as an affront to both national and human dignity. As public discourse shifted, the ledger's protectors found their social armor tarnished. Once tarnish appears on a shield, the sword of public opinion grows more effective. Trials that followed were messy but significant deposits of evidence, witness testimonies, and cross-examinations revealed the interlocking mechanisms of the trade. In some towns, convictions followed, in others only small indictments occurred, but all left marks. Each mark made the route harder to travel in secrecy. The human stories, when recovered, were brutal and bittersweet. Children found after months or years bore the imprint of new lives. Some had learned to survive and adapted to harsh labor, others grew fragile under overwork. There were reunions that healed and reunions that broke. When a mother found a child who had been trafficked and later recovered, the embrace was often a mix of recognition and estrangement. The child had been shaped by another world and bore memories that did not belong solely to the family. Reintegration required time, care, and sometimes legal guardianship that could restore a child's rights but not fully the lost years. For some children, rescue came too late. They had been moved beyond the reach of sympathetic systems, sold further into labor that left them untraceable. The trade's most aching crime was this erasure, not merely of bodies but of histories, of names, of the small domestic continuities that anchor identity. Yet rescue stories also revealed courage and cunning. A captain who defected and testified, a tavern girl who smuggled a note, a parish clerk who kept hidden records. These small acts of defiance built into resistance networks that could outlast continuous repression. As more of these acts accumulated, they formed a moral ledger that could be presented to courts, to city councils, and to the broader public. The narrative moved from anecdote to pattern, and patterns, when visible, forced institutional reckoning. Towns that once profited quietly had to face scandal. Wealth that had been invested to build public institutions, libraries, parks, churches, found itself stained by association. Donors who had lent their names to civic projects were now linked by file and testimony to a trade that sold children. The social cost of complicity grew heavy enough to bend financial and political will toward reform. Reform took shape through a patchwork of local initiatives and growing national awareness. Some towns established stricter apprenticeship registration laws, others required more rigorous checks of guardianship claims. Port authorities began to pay greater attention to adverted, miscellaneous cargoes, and some customs offices instituted cross-referencing of manifests with parish and municipal records. These were imperfect solutions, easily circumvented at first, but they created additional friction for smugglers. Friction meant delay, and delay meant exposure. Meanwhile, Philanthropic groups raised funds to support recovered children and their families, creating a modest but crucial safety net. These groups built networks of foster houses and schools that provided alternatives to exploitative placements. Their work was not merely charitable but structural. They attempted to outcompete the trade by offering legitimate placements for children in need, education, caretaking, and legal protection. The cultural shift also mattered. As newspapers published exposés and as ministers delivered sermons about the sanctity of childhood, public sentiment hardened against human commodification. Even those who once excused the trade as economic necessity found themselves challenged by a new moral consensus. The reformers' strategy was twofold: to increase oversight and to reduce demand. Reducing demand meant pressing industries to hire paid labor and to resist the appeal of unpaid apprentice work that undercut wages. It meant lobbying mill owners and ship captains to adopt ethical hiring practices and to view children as wards rather than disposable assets. These efforts were slow and met fierce resistance, but they chipped away. Where commerce had found easy paths through indifference, reformers built new obstacles. Each obstacle forced decisions either to change conduct or to seek new, riskier avenues of concealment. The trade's expansion became costlier and more dangerous, and costlier enterprises leave more traces behind. As the trade's network frayed, some participants moved toward quieter lives, while others became more brazen in desperation. Men who had once depended on casual bribery discovered they now needed more elaborate schemes, fake orphanages that operated like shell corporations, false registries of apprentices that had no physical oversight, and covert agreements with shipping lines to mislabel human cargo. These advanced tactics often required collusion at higher levels. Bankers who turned a blind eye, lawyers who laundered signatures, and magistrates who rubber-stamped suspicious agreements. The trade's adaptation demonstrates a grim principle: economic incentives shape ingenuity, and ingenuity can be mobilized for cruelty as readily as for creation. But adaptation also breeds complexity, and with complexity, potential failure. Larger schemes require more people, and more people mean more chances for leaks. Investigators realized they could exploit the complexity. They began to focus attention on peripheral actors: clerks, tavern owners, dock foremen, people who could be pressured into cooperation through legal action, moral censure, or even financial incentive. The strategy worked. When a clerk confessed and handed over a stack of forged documents, the chain that once looked impregnable became susceptible to prosecution. Trials grew longer and more public, and with public trials came testimony that illuminated the trade structure for a wider audience. Spectators in courtrooms heard names and saw patterns, and newspapers carried those revelations into drawing rooms and meeting halls across the region. The publicity forced many civic leaders to reconsider how much they could ignore, and it gave victims a stage where their stories could be heard and weighed in public judgment. Yet even as reformers made gains, the aftereffects of the trade lingered for generations. Communities that had allowed children to be commodified carried the memory like a scar. Civic pride had to reconcile with shame. Families that had lost children sometimes never recovered the social fabric they once possessed. Economically, some towns experienced downturns when reform reduced the cheap labor that had once bolstered local industry. The social cost of this shift was real and painful, complicating the moral narrative of reform. Still, many argued that a moral economy was worth short-term disruption. The moral and legal changes that followed the exposure of the route had lasting impact: stricter documentation, improved oversight, and a public willingness to scrutinize the intersection of commerce and welfare. Internationally, the trade's exposure influenced how ports conducted business. Reputational risk made some shipping houses change practices rather than face boycott. A culture that once normalized harm found ways to legislate restraint. But legislation alone was insufficient. The most enduring remedy came through cultural change, the steady accumulation of stories, the work of educators, and the slow retraining of civic institutions to value vulnerable lives not as ledger entries but as citizens. Schools taught children to question offers of sudden improvement. Churches preached accountability. Town councils enacted local safeguards. These measures were imperfect, but they formed a defensive lattice against the return of the old trade. The struggle between the ledger and conscience thus became a long duel between an economy of convenience and a public ethics that refused to be bought. When historians later looked back, they found the trade's memory fragmented and scattered, preserved in marginalia, in family letters, and in the odd court transcript that survived some cellar fire. Those fragments, when assembled, tell a larger story not only about smugglers and opium, but about how societies rationalize cruelty. The rote's existence challenged a simple narrative of American innocence in the 19th century, revealing instead a nation in which commerce sometimes trumped compassion and where legal forms could be engineered to disguise moral rot. The evidence suggests the trade was not an isolated pathology, but a function of structural vulnerabilities, poverty, lax oversight, and the seductive logic of profit. Understanding that function is critical because it shows how similar patterns can re-emerge when incentives align. Our responsibility, then, is not merely to catalogue horrors but to learn the mechanisms and to build durable institutions that resist commodification of human lives. Memory plays a moral role. Remembering those traded and those who suffered gives us both the obligation and the means to prevent recurrence. When we read the ledger, we must not be content with horror alone. We should be driven to action. That action can be legal, social, and educational. It is legal in courts and councils, social in community vigilance and mutual aid, educational in altering the narratives told to children about mobility and charity. Only by attending to all three can a society hope to prevent the ledger from being written again. So hear this as a final whisper and a charge. The forgotten route of 1848 is more than history. It is a warning encoded in paper and bones. The smugglers who traded children for opium did not operate in a vacuum. They exploited gaps in law, hunger in households, and the complacency of respectable civic life. Their methods teach us how cruelty hides behind paperwork and how institutions can be co-opted when profit outweighs dignity. But their story also tells us about resistance, the quiet courage of a dockworker who refused a coin, the clerk who kept a copy of an altered manifest, the midwife who hid a child's name. Those acts, small and human, created openings for reform and recovery. If you carry away one thing from this recounting, let it be the idea that moral vigilance is not glamorous but necessary. Watch the ledgers of your time for euphemisms that hide harm. Demand transparency from institutions that trade in human labor. Teach the next generation to name things clearly and to challenge when language softens atrocity. The ledger that once erased names can be rewritten by public insistence and by the relentless work of those who refuse commodification. Remember their names, remember the routes, and when you encounter the comforting rhetoric of necessity, ask whose children it profits and whose conscience it costs.